benedicta tu in mulier.
Hello, and welcome to Historia Ecclesiastica. My name is Daniel Sudi, and in this The Enlightenment and the World Wars video, we will be discussing the very controversial topic about how Hitler was liberal and his ideology was quite on brand for the type of liberalism which was spreading across the Western world ever since the French Revolution. He is, in fact, a son of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, just as much as the other liberal movements which spread throughout Europe during that time period. Let's begin with a prayer for world peace. This is an excerpt from Pope Pius XII's prayer for world peace. He was the reigning pope during World War II. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Grant, O Lord, peace in our days, peace to souls, peace to families, peace to our country, and peace among nations. Our Lady, Queen of Peace, pray for us. Please like, share, and subscribe, and if you are enjoying the video, please go ahead and look for some comments below and leave a response based on what you watched or what you can bring to the table here for this discussion about how Hitler emerges from the liberal Enlightenment and French Revolution rather than him being a conservative opponent of the liberalism which had taken over the West throughout the 19th century. So let's talk about that thumbnail, okay? I already have a little bit, but let's talk a little bit more about it, okay? Marxist historiography, which is the school of history, which is arguably the most dominant school of history in universities today, commonly characterizes Hitler as a right-wing conservative, and that is the typical definition or description you'll get of Hitler throughout different examinations of his life. He was, to be certain, opposed to communism, so in that sense he was not in the same manner a liberal as communists are. He was opposed to it. And he was also opposed to republicanism. He was opposed to the Weimar Republic established after World War I. He considered that republic to be traitors to the glory of the German nation. So he was opposed to that form of liberalism. But we'll see in this video here that the style of government and the ideology he had was another flavor of liberalism. It wasn't opposed to liberalism in general. He himself had many liberal ideas and was inspired by liberal philosophers. Napoleon, as well as Hitler, were both opposed to republicanism, but Napoleon would never be considered conservative. He was a champion of the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment. Hitler and the fascist movement in Italy, his own Nazi response to communism, and his opposition to representative government was in fact still a product of the Enlightenment revolution and was just as much opposed to traditional Christian Western values as communism and French republicanism were. In this video, I argue that the ideology of Adolf Hitler was progressive in the sense that he was seamlessly continuing the tradition of the liberal German Enlightenment and was continuing the 150-year process of ordering society according to atheistic premises, which were, of course, liberal in relationship to the traditional Christian dogmas from which they were revolting. We talked in the last several videos about what we mean by liberal here in these videos. Some people define 19th century liberalism very narrowly as referring only to liberal democratic forms of government, but even in the 19th century, liberalism can also be understood as being liberal or free in relationship to traditional theology, traditional philosophy, and traditional customs and beliefs in general. So the term liberal from the 19th century onwards is describing people that feel free from the constraints of traditional Christian institutions and beliefs. In practice, liberal thought is pragmatically atheistic because it seeks to be free from divine revelation, what God has revealed in the dogmas of the Catholic faith. And so in practice, liberal institutions and liberal thought is atheistic. It seeks to ignore what God has revealed and seek truth only through reason alone. It was the Enlightenment which gave the world liberalism. And as we shall see, Hitler's Nazism was heavily inspired by a wide variety of either Enlightenment thinkers or intellectuals who were descendants of Enlightenment thinkers in their schools of thought. In this video, we're going to begin by talking about the intellectual genealogy of the Nazi and the fascist movements, which I am inclined to describe those movements as separate, although they are very connected and they worked together. I do not like to describe them as one and the same movement. Neither do a lot of historians today. We'll then talk about the liberal philosophers who inspired Hitler's Nazism. We will talk about why fascism, a political movement in Italy, which inspired Hitler when he was in the early years of kind of shaping the ideology of the Nazi Party. We'll talk about why Mussolini's fascism was an extremely liberal political movement and was extremely inspired by Napoleon, the French Revolution, and the Enlightenment. We will then talk about the personal interior religious and spiritual beliefs of Adolf Hitler. We're going to address Hitler's anti-Semitism, since it was a key part of the mythos which he was using to unite the German Volk, and we'll talk about the Holocaust as well. And then, just as an appendix, we're going to address Hitler and homosexuality, because that's one of the reasons many people see him as a conservative, was he was opposed to homosexuality. But we're going to talk about why having an opposition to homosexuality was a pretty mainstream liberal attitude at the time, because liberal psychology, which was built, psychology in general, as we talked about in the very first video in the series, that's really the atheistic attempt to talk about the soul without talking about God or any Christian anthropological ideas. So liberal psychology in the 1930s was pretty much in agreement, in a consensus, that homosexuality was a mental illness, and Hitler was just following what secular psychologists were saying at the time. Okay, let's get started. Part 1 is the genealogy of the Nazi movement. We're going to look at how the Nazi movement itself is a direct descendant of other liberal political movements of the 19th century. We're going to look at this question. Did Nazism emerge from conservative intellectuals? So was Hitler, who is not the founder of the Nazi Party, but he joined it very early on in its conception, and he's really the one who shaped the Nazi ideology by the time the party was significant in German politics. So if Hitler is really, basically, you could say he's the founder of the Nazi Party. And let's look at this, guys. Was his were his inspirations for the Nazi movement conservative intellectuals or liberal Enlightenment-based intellectuals? We'll look at that a bit here, and we're going to look at that a lot more thoroughly in the third section of this video. Okay, so was Nazism a right-wing political party, as most people would describe it as, most historians, if you look at just the encyclopedia page of the Nazi Party, it will be described as a right-wing party. So when Nazism is described as a right-wing party, this is typically what the historian that you're looking at is thinking of when they think of left and right. So they have this sort of a spectrum in their heads. At the very far left is communism, or maybe you'd even say anarchy. And then further to the right, they separate socialism from communism for whatever reason. Socialism and communism are, practically speaking, identical since the 20th century began. Liberalism itself, which is defined here as like a political party within a moderate form of government. Moderate is in the middle. Then we have conservatism. Libertarianism is considered to the right of conservatism, which I think there's flaws with that as well. Libertarians socially and morally are definitely to the left of most conservatives. And then we have fascism, which is usually considered an umbrella term for the government of Italy, and Japan and Germany in the 1930s is considered the farthest right political system. So this spectrum, which most people have in their heads when they talk about political movements of the 20th and 21st centuries, this is a very bad way of thinking about how these political movements are related to one another. Let's look at this, guys, to kind of talk about why the placement of these different political movements on this arbitrary spectrum is not the most accurate. Let's think about what the origin of the terms left and right wing is when referring to political movements. The origin of the left-right classification of political movements dates back to the French Revolution itself. In the National Assembly of 1789, when there were vehement debates over whether or not the French Revolution should occur, we read from Baron de Gauville, Quote, "We began to recognize each other. Those who were loyal to religion and the king took up positions to the right of the chair, that is, of the presider of the assembly, so as to avoid the shouts, oaths, and indecencies that enjoyed free reign in the opposing camp, that is, on the left side." So basically, during a very turbulent debate in the National Assembly of 1789, those in favor of the French Revolution, those in favor of abolishing the monarchy, and those in favor of abolishing the privileges and the influence of the church over the state, they assembled themselves on the left side of the National Assembly, and those in favor of religion and the monarchy established themselves on the right wing. So those on the right side of the National Assembly were in favor of restoring the ancient Christian order of society towards God's service. That is what right wing meant originally. And in its most pure sense, right wing refers to those who want to restore the traditional Christian order of Western civilization. Left wing, then, when this term of right and left wing politics began, referred to those in favor of overthrowing the old Christian order and establishing a new secular state, which was inspired not by the tenets of divine revelation, but was inspired by the tenets of the atheistic Enlightenment philosophers. It was Napoleon, a very left-wing politician and military leader, who would advance the secular atheistic vision of the left wing of the National Assembly throughout the European continent. While himself not believing that democracy was an efficient form of government, Napoleon's vision for the ideal state, even though he wanted to bring it about through enlightened despotism, was informed, of course, not by divine revelation, but Napoleon's vision for the ideal state was informed by the principles of the Enlightenment, making him the most influential liberal of the 19th century, and perhaps the most impactful liberal ever in world history. We read from historian Andrew Roberts in his book Napoleon the Great, published in 2014. He wrote of Napoleon, saying, quote, "The ideas that underpin our modern world, meritocracy, equality before the law, property rights, religious toleration, modern secular education, sound finances, and so on, were championed, consolidated, codified, and geographically extended by Napoleon." So Roberts is arguing that Napoleon is solely responsible for spreading these liberal values throughout Western civilization. I'm not saying every one of these values is bad, and of course Roberts is framing the spread of liberalism throughout the West as a positive. He titled his book Napoleon the Great. I'm sure we could also list a number of negative liberal effects on Western civilization if we had a different bias about liberalism in general. We could say that Napoleon was to the 19th century what Alexander the Great was to the ancient world, just as Alexander the Great's conquests throughout the Near East and as far as India were essential in spreading Hellenism throughout the ancient world. Napoleon's conquests were equally essential in spreading liberalism throughout the modern one. Now, let's zoom forward to Hitler, because he's the topic of study here, okay? If Napoleon is perhaps the most impactful liberal in world history, let's look at what Hitler said about Napoleon. As soon as France unconditionally surrendered to the Nazi Empire, Hitler made a point to go visit Paris. He admired the Parisians, and he admired French culture in general. In 1940, he venerated the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte. You can see a picture of it in the middle here. He admired the tomb of the man who used brutal force to impose the French Revolution's liberal, secular, atheistic values throughout the continent. And he said, referring to this event, that seeing the tomb of Napoleon was, quote, "the greatest and finest moment of my life," end quote. Would a conservative say that seeing the tomb of one of history's most notorious, bloodthirstiest liberals was one of the greatest and finest moments of his life? The Nazi Party was absolutely not in favor of restoring the ancient regime of Christian civilization. Ideologically, if Nazis were present in the 1789 National Assembly, they would belong on the left wing of this assembly, as close to the wall as possible. Now let's trace the origins of liberalism in politics, and let's look at how Nazism comes out of modern liberalism. Traditionally, in medieval Europe, we had the principles outlined in St. Augustine's City of God guiding Western civilization. The idea that the entire society should seek to be unified with the City of God, pursuing the values of the City of God, even in the temporal city of man. The humanist movements and the Renaissance movements of the late medieval period sought to return intelligentsia towards using classical Aristotelian models to pursue big questions. In and of itself, that is not bad, but this begins to set the tone in academia to question traditional premises, which it's not bad to be a skeptic. It's good to challenge things to make sure we're not accepting things that are incorrect, just kind of in our societies. But the idea of challenging traditional knowledge spreads into theology, and it doesn't belong in theology. In theology, there needs to be an obedience to the divine revelation, to the sacred tradition which has been passed on. Innovation in theology is always bad because that implies that what Jesus passed on was incorrect, or what the church fathers have passed on was incorrect. Martin Luther is seeking to improve upon the theological tradition which he inherited. Protestants inspired by Martin Luther are going to begin challenging all kinds of traditional doctrines of divine revelation and sacred tradition. In order to justify innovating theology, they're going to go ahead and say that the theology of the Catholic Church was corrupted. Usually they say this after the reign of Constantine. The theological tradition of the Catholic Church became corrupted. That is the reason I created this YouTube channel, was to show that the early theology of the Church before Constantine was identical to the theology of the Catholic Church today. There was no corruption unless there was a heretic, such as Martin Luther, corrupting it. Okay? So Martin Luther's Protestantism is going to begin to inspire the philosophical movements such as Cartesianism. While Descartes was not himself a Protestant, he was a Catholic, and he did attempt to use his philosophical strategies to prove the existence of God, and he was even successful in converting the Queen of Sweden to Catholicism. Regardless, his theological tradition of trying to establish the first premise upon which all other premises can be built ends up identifying only subjective thought as being something that we can have absolute certainty in, and he believes we cannot know things in and of themselves, but we can only know ideas about those things. This is going to begin to it's going to begin to send Western intellectual thought into a sort of whirlpool of doubt, doubting everything that we thought we could assume was true. And that whirlpool of doubt is going to give us the thought of the various Enlightenment thinkers who are challenging all of the premises which Western civilization used to be built upon, even and especially Christian premises which Western civilization used to be built upon. It is the thinkers of the Enlightenment which are going to give us the various secular states of the 19th century. I have a whole video titled The Secular States of the 19th Century. Please check it out. These states include French republicanism, the British capitalistic state, which is inspired both by John Locke's social contract theory, and it's also inspired by Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is going to inspire industrial revolutions throughout the West in general. And the ideology of the Prussian German Reich and the adoration of the German nation, or the German Volk, is very inspired by George Hegel and other German Enlightenment thinkers who identified the German nation itself as a sort of spiritual reality, which was in the midst of a sort of cosmic struggle, not only for survival, but for the accomplishment of its own glory. So especially in Prussia and in the forming German Empire, because of the form of Enlightenment thought in Germany, there is a heavy emphasis on the glory of the nation, and there's this spiritual sense that the German nation needs to persevere through some great cosmic struggle against other ethnicities. Okay? And that sort of thinking of hyper-idolatrous nationalism is going to be very influential to Adolf Hitler. So here's a little family tree. We begin with traditional Western society, which you might call Roman Christendom. I argue in another video that the Roman civilization of antiquity survived all the way until the Enlightenment snuffed it out. You can go watch that. It's Why the Roman Empire Didn't Fall Until the 19th Century is the title of that one. Through the intellectual revolutions we just discussed, we have the Enlightenment, which gives birth to the British capitalistic state, French republicanism, and the Prussian-German Reich and the adoration of the Volk. And all three of the values of all three of these states are in dialogue with one another, and so all three of these states are kind of borrowing from one another. Hyper-nationalism would become a factor in French and British statecraft as well, and as I said, industrialization would become a factor in these other states as well. And these weren't the only three secular states. Virtually all other European states were borrowing from these ideas and were moving in the direction of liberalism. That's not to say that traditional Christian ideas were completely dissolved in these societies. Of course, most people were still Christian at the beginning of the 20th century. But the point is, the institutions, especially the political institutions of these societies, are moving in the direction of the Enlightenment, and they're beginning to base their policies off of the ideas of the Enlightenment rather than the ideas found in the City of God by St. Augustine. Okay? The philosophical values of radical equality and materialism, which were very popular in the French Revolution, and the rejection of capitalism, which was very popular in the British state, would lead to the formation of communism, just a new form of statecraft, which was born of the Enlightenment. Okay, so communism has its roots in the Enlightenment, even if the specific shape of communism is different than other forms of state, which also had roots in the Enlightenment. Also, the hypernationalism, new imperialism, and industrialization of the 19th century would coalesce, along with just atheistic thought in general, would coalesce to form fascism. So fascism in the 1920s in Italy, and states which were inspired by fascism, such as Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire, those states are adopting a form of statecraft which also has roots in the Enlightenment, even if the specific character of fascism is still different from French republicanism or British parliamentary democracy. All these states, okay, communist states, fascist states, French Republican-styled states, and parliamentary democracies, these are all Enlightenment-inspired forms of state. These are all liberal to their core because they're accepting the liberal premises of the Enlightenment as the foundation of their form of state, even though they are all different. So we can describe each of these forms of state as liberal. Meanwhile, modern traditional conservatives persist in most of these states, even though they're fiercely persecuted in some, such as in communist states and fascist states. Modern traditional conservatives were the conservative constituents of liberal states who wished to integrate elements of Christendom in modern secular states. So modern traditional conservatives were very popular in the United States because it was those who wanted to integrate Christian ideas into the secular states, which had caused the abolition of slavery, and that's the Republican Party. The Republican Party, which has its origins in Christian theology then, are going to be very popular after the Civil War, seeing that the Democrats were rightly blamed for the Civil War. And the Republicans are going to kind of claim a monopoly on the White House until the Great Depression, from the Civil War all the way to the Great Depression for that reason. So there's this powerful conservative faction of politics in the United States. And in Mussolini's fascist state, there was also a number of people who still believed in a lot of Catholic teachings, and the Pope was still very active in politics in Italy. And so despite the fact that he did not want to, Mussolini had to compromise with Catholicism and traditional conservatism more than, let's say, Hitler had to, or more than the oligarchs of Japan had to during the same time period. Okay? So modern traditional conservatives are going to continue to try to integrate their ideas into the secular states in which they live. Authentic conservatives are trying to orient society towards God, because that is the traditional bedrock of Western civilizations. We could describe as liberal anyone who is not trying to conserve traditional Christian values in the secular states in which they live. To be sure, there do exist conservatives today who would have still sat on the left side of the 1789 French Assembly. We can refer to what we might call Enlightenment-inspired conservatives, while Christian conservatives value above all the service and adoration of God and the obedience to his commands, and clearly recognize that society should be oriented towards the glory of God, and that their citizenship is first and foremost in heaven before being in the secular state, Enlightenment-inspired conservatives desire to conserve values which originate with the Enlightenment or some point after the Enlightenment. Such Enlightenment-inspired conservatives, which dare I call liberal conservatives, may collaborate with Christian conservatives, and in fact often do, but they will also hold values which are opposed to Christendom's values, especially sexual values in the modern world. There are a lot of conservatives who are very indifferent regarding sexual issues. They don't really care about sexual morality, either in their personal lives or in policy. And that's because they've accepted the sexual revolution, a 1960s liberal movement, to some degree. And traditional Christian, authentic conservatives, of course, are not willing to compromise with sexual morality. So there do exist conservatives who would have sat on the left side of the 1789 French Assembly. Mitt Romney would have sat very close to that wall. I'm saying that in jest a bit. And even Donald Trump, as effective as he is at advancing conservative values, or as effective as he was in his last presidency, could definitely be described as a liberal conservative. He seeks to conserve values which have their origin in the Enlightenment or some Enlightenment-inspired institution. He has, in his 2024 platform, expressed philosophical indifference towards abortion, saying it should remain merely a state's decision. He's also expressed throughout his political career indifference toward LGBT issues, except for in his new platform. He's opposed to the chemical surgical mutilation of minors. So he's opposed to like children transitioning. He's opposed to the transgender participation in women's sports. But he's indifferent towards what people do in their personal lives, which is an indication that he's accepted certain liberal values, even while he could still be described as a conservative. Also, in the first day of the RNC, he permitted a Sikh political activist to pray a Sikh prayer to the deity Waheguru, the false deity Waheguru, and in which she thanked this false deity for saving his life in the assassination attempt, which is a very bold and sad act of blasphemy. He should have only been glorifying the one true God for saving him, but he permitted this Sikh to publicly thank a false deity for saving him. It reminds you of when the Israelites, bowed down to the golden calf and said, "Behold the God who took you out of Egypt." I'm not saying you shouldn't vote for Trump. He's still obviously going to do more to restore Western civilization in the direction of traditional Christendom than, of course, Kamala would. At the same time, we can't ignore that he has a lot of liberal values which do not have their origin in Christian civilization. You can pause and read the rest of that if you'd like. We got to keep moving. But in this video, and in general throughout this series, our understanding of what conservative and liberal means is that a liberal politician is, or liberal thought, or liberal philosophy in general, is a system of philosophical, moral, or political thought that is free or liberal in relationship to divine revelation and traditional Christian values, while conservative thought is a system of philosophical, moral, or political thought that is based upon the doctrines of divine revelation and the implications of those doctrines for modern statecraft and other institutions. Keeping all of that in mind, can we say in any sense that Nazis were conservative? Well, back in the 1930s, Christian conservatives would value above all the service and adoration of God, the obedience to his commands, and the integration of the institutions of society with the will of Almighty God. Christian conservative parties were more influential and perhaps more bold in not compromising with liberal ideas in the 1930s, and the Pope was still very active in vocalizing Christian ideas for statecraft, and a lot more Catholics at that time were more insistent on insisting that those Catholic ideas were integrated into modern states. You can consider, for example, how the United States bishops during that time period would forbid any Catholics from attending any movies that had unchristian messages. In fact, the modern movie rating system has its origins in the lists that Catholic bishops would publish telling Catholics which movies they could or couldn't see. So think about how bold that was and how Catholics back then demanded that society be integrated with the fullest sense of what the Catholic what a Catholic society should look like. Like, we Catholics used to demand that, even living in secular societies. So that's what a conservative looked like back then in the most authentic sense of the term. Nazis, on the other hand, desired to conserve only the values of the German Empire. So in the 1920s, the Nazis were saying, let's conserve what our state looked like a decade ago, rather than centuries ago, like authentic conservatives were still trying to conserve. They especially wanted to conserve hyper-nationalism, the new imperialism, and the industrialization of the German Empire. They also sought to integrate a number of liberal, atheistic, scientific strains of thought, especially social Darwinism and Nietzsche's political theories, into German statecraft. The Nazis' scientific racism discussed with the Jews and acceptance of Enlightenment-based atheism led to a hatred of Christianity due to its proper interpretation of the faith of the Jews and its acknowledgement that Jesus was providing the authentic interpretation of the Jewish covenant with God, and thus the Nazis rejected Christianity in general because of its connection with Judaism, but also because they believed wholeheartedly in the atheistic ideas of the French and the German Enlightenments. While perhaps seeking to conserve the Reich of the beginning of the 20th century compared to the fledgling Republic of the 20th, very little in the Nazi platform could be described as extremely right-wing. As I've said already, the values, philosophical premises, and the free use of the most cutting-edge atheistic scientific findings indicates that the Nazis would have sat relatively close to the wall of the left side of the French Assembly. Dare I say it, Nazism is a left-wing political movement. Let's look now at the philosophically liberal foundations of Nazism. We're going to look at a summary of the body of work of the most widely recognized philosophers and polemicists who heavily influenced Adolf Hitler. So I'm not just pulling these philosophers out of thin air. The general historiography of Nazism, which you could find if you just went on Google and typed in what philosophers influenced Nazism, you would see these philosophers. So let's look at what these philosophers taught, and let's look at how liberal these philosophers were. Okay, so that's this part. To begin, Hitler can be called a liberal because, in the sense in which the word was understood in the 18th century, he was opposed to traditional Christendom's principles of statecraft. His political, racial, and philosophical thought was entirely formed by the post-Enlightenment liberal intelligentsia. The only thing he was trying to conserve was the liberal ideas of the German Enlightenment and the liberal ideas of secular rationalists in general. Okay? So to review a little bit from our first video, some of the most influential German Enlightenment thinkers included Johann Gottfried Herder, who championed cultural nationalism, which identified a sort of metaphysical national spirit, or Volk, which was comprised of the culture and language of each society, and which needed to and the state needed to protect and pass on this Volk to future generations. He believed that one day all of world history was moving towards an international culture. So that concept of the Volk was extremely influential in Hitler's ideology. George Hegel believed that all segmented parts of history and the universe were moving towards a unified totality in which the metaphysical form of the universe would finally be actualized. He thought the universe wasn't even done being formed yet, but the different parts of the universe would eventually be unified. So that's a metaphysical kind of spiritual belief that was very influential throughout the German Enlightenment. It was interpreted different ways by the Marxists and the Nazis. Marxists believed that the global totality towards which all human society was moving was a global communist utopia. Nazism evidently had a different vision for the totality toward which all of history was moving. They believed it would be because they combined this concept of an inevitable totality with social Darwinist thoughts that all ethnicities were competing for survival, Nazis believed that the Aryan race, which they defined as the supreme race, was destined towards world domination. And eventually they would outbreed the inferior races, and that would be the totality. So they combined kind of Hegel's thought with social Darwinism to form their own thought. Hitler, as we will see, was also inspired by a great number of other Germanic Enlightenment thinkers. We are now going to look at the philosophers upon whom Nazism was built. However, as a disclaimer, most historians will be quick to tell you that these philosophers would not have necessarily been in agreement with Nazism. They would not have necessarily liked the direction that Hitler built upon their thought. But at the same time, their liberal systems of thought were definitely the explicit foundations upon which the Nazi movement was built. Nazis referenced these philosophers, and they did form logical conclusions off of their liberal thought. In my opinion, liberal academia is overly defensive of many of these philosophers because they recognize these liberal philosophers as being cut of the same cloth as their own liberal, thought. And so liberal academia today prefers to obscure the manner in which these philosophers did explicitly contribute to Hitler's ideology. Liberal academia is more willing to explicitly condemn scientific racism, social Darwinism, and its founders, but even in that regard, they shouldn't be let off the hook. Liberal academia today should be held accountable for the scientific racism and social Darwinism because these movements emerged out of the same atheistic and rationalistic premises that liberal academia emerges from today. As I said, Hitler himself referenced the philosophers we're about to discuss, and he himself claimed that his movement was inspired by them. Let's begin. Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a German. He lived from 1844 to 1900. Assorted texts of Nietzsche were placed in the backpacks of German soldiers during World War II. This is a quote about Nietzsche's work and its connection to Nazism. You can see the link there, and you can Google that there if you want to read that whole article. Liberal bourgeois existence, the very ideas of Christian morality, democracy, and rationality, filled Nietzsche with contempt. God is dead, he declared, and mankind must reinvent itself in a new image of greatness. The door was open. And so he's identifying Nietzsche here as being a progressive, anti-Christian, and a liberal. But just what new image of greatness would mankind invent for itself in a post-Christian, atheistic world? Nazis combined this thought-provoking question with social Darwinistic thought to come to their conclusion. The Aryan race would be the new definition of greatness in a post-Christian atheistic world. So as I said, Nazism, if you want to boil it down to two philosophies, it's kind of a combination of Nietzsche's anything goes, political violence is fine as long as you're using it for a good purpose, though good itself isn't clearly defined in an atheistic worldview. So Nazism, if you want to boil it down to two thinkers, it could be boiled down to Nietzsche and the social Darwinism that emerges from Darwin's natural selection. We talked about Darwin himself a lot in the very first video of this series. We talked about how evolution itself was not necessarily Darwin's invention. In fact, his own grandfather had published a book about evolution titled Zoomania. And we talked about how his origin of species articulated not evolution, but the process of natural selection, which is basically just saying that, it's basically arguing that the process we see in agriculture with intentional breeding of animals to be more favorable for our purposes, that happens in the wild because the needs to be the best at surviving naturally breeds organisms. And so Darwin is arguing that's what causes the changes is natural selection, a natural form of breeding. And that's where we get the term survival of the fittest. Please feel free to pause if you want to read more about this. I covered this all in the first video. Harvard's Louis Agassiz, who lived from 1807 to 1873, took Darwin's thought and helped develop social Darwinism. He believed in polygenesis, the belief that humanity was composed of distinct species. His studies were supported by craniology, a legitimate science in the 19th century, which analyzed the skulls of dead humans. He believed that the skulls of whites proved that this race was intellectually superior to the skulls of blacks, and his findings were commonly accepted science in the 19th century. I'm not supporting them, of course, I'm not at all, because I'm trying to say that, of course, atheistic liberal science has issues when it's untethered from the bedrock of divine revelation. But that's what atheistic science said in the 19th century. Just as atheistic science says some crazy things today, if you would call liberal psychiatry, psychology, and gender theory scientific. Later psychological studies pointed towards increased rates of aggression in blacks and higher academic achievements in whites, trying to say that basically whites were more intelligent, blacks were more aggressive. That's what they thought at the time. Of course, they did not adequately account for differences in social economic situations. Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin, who lived from 1822 to 1911, gave birth to the eugenics movement as an attempt to establish political advocacy groups across Western nations to determine how to better society, basically through breeding. So according to Galton and eugenicists, conditions in the modern world were interfering with natural selection and were allowing basically flawed bloodlines to continue reproducing at a rate similar to superior bloodlines. Eugenicists sought to better society by preventing unfit persons from passing on their genes through reproduction. In 1907, in fact, Indiana, the state, the Midwestern state, passed compulsory sterilization laws which would sterilize those deemed unfit for reproduction, including imbecile women or idiot inmates in prison. And so compulsory sterilization laws were already being passed in the early 20th century. It is this movement, this extremely atheistic liberal movement of social Darwinism and eugenics, which would be very influential to Hitler's thought when it came to establishing racial purity in his German empire. The liberal eugenics movement. Let's talk a little bit more about that. We'll talk about the eugenics movement in the United States, led by Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, and how her liberal movement in our country had a lot of similarities and, in fact, explicit connections with Nazism during the same time period. Surveys were disseminated throughout Western nations by eugenics organizations to begin to create pedigree maps, deeming familial traits of feeble-mindedness, criminality, and alcoholism sufficient to bar a person from legal reproduction. Margaret Sanger was the leader of the American eugenics movement, and she intentionally placed Planned Parenthood abortion clinics in heavily black areas, as we will see in a moment, because she did wish to exterminate the black population in the United States. Those are her words, not mine. On the cover of her November 1921 birth control magazine, she gave the magazine the headline, "Birth Control to Create a Race of Thoroughbreds." Let's look at the connections between Sanger and Nazism. And we're doing this because Sanger is identified as a champion of liberal birth control and just liberal sexual ethics in general. Even today, Planned Parenthood still celebrates Margaret Sanger, and they give an employee every year the Margaret Sanger Award. So they still recognize her as a sort of champion of their values. So Planned Parenthood, synonymous with American liberalism today, they champion Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was on the same page as Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, explicitly. This is a quote from Margaret Sanger. She said, and you can look at the link there, punch it in if you want to read the whole article. She said, "The most successful educational approach to the Negro is through a religious appeal. We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out the idea if it ever occurs to any of their rebellious members." Exterminate the Negro population. That is quite the choice of word. Extermination is a word that is usually used to describe to household pests and bugs, right? Rodents. Hitler once said, "The sacred mission of the German people to assemble and preserve the most valuable racial elements and raise them to the dominant position." As we said before, she hoped to create a race of thoroughbreds. She published an article from Anna Blunt in her The Birth Control Review. So she is kind of agreeing with these words by giving them her approval by publishing them in her periodical. Anna Blunt once said, "They must be eliminated. Eugenics makes birth control imperative, but whatever the means of this stream of human waste must be deflected from the melting pot. Godspeed the day when the unwilling mother, with her weak, puny body, her sad, anemic, unlovely face, and her dependent wine will be no more. In that day we shall see a race of American thoroughbreds, if not Superman." Hitler said, "Our ultimate goal must be the removal of the Jews altogether." Sanger's magazine published articles written by her personal friend and advisor, Ernst Rudin. Ernst Rudin, at the exact same time in which he published an article in Sanger's periodical, was serving as Hitler's director of genetic sterilization. So they worked together. And that comes from Killer Angel, a biography of Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger. You can look that book up. That's on page 71 and 72. Hitler ultimately came to the conclusion that he should purify the bloodlines of the German Empire through murdering undesirables outside of the womb. Sanger believed that eugenics should be accomplished through forced sterilizations and the encouraging of contraceptives and abortion inside the womb. She wanted to do those things in undesirable populations, especially in areas where there were a lot of black people. That's how she hoped to purify. And frankly, just in about the 1960s, blacks composed about 22% of America's population. Today it's about 12%. So Margaret Sanger is getting what she wanted as a result of her establishment of Planned Parenthood clinics in black areas. So Nazism, Planned Parenthood. Nazism exterminates 11 million through their eugenics policies. Planned Parenthood, which was founded upon eugenics policies, has exterminated 60 million children since Roe v. Wade alone, and worldwide, of course, that number is more like 300 million. These two ideologies are connected in their origins, and I'm saying that, of course, to throw some punches at Planned Parenthood and the evil they do, but I'm also saying that because I'm making the video here that Hitler was liberal, and everyone recognizes Planned Parenthood is liberal, and they were on the same page. Godless ideologies do godless, barbaric things. Let's go back to learn about other liberal philosophers who inspired Nazism. And as a reminder, liberals are those who seek to be free or liberal in relationship to divine revelation and traditional Christian Western values, while the term conservative really describes the system of philosophical, moral, or political thought that is based upon divine revelation and the implications of those doctrines for modern statecraft. Hitler, his favorite philosopher is often considered to be Arthur Schopenhauer, a German who lived from 1788 to 1860. He actually brought a book from Schopenhauer with him to the front lines of World War I. Schopenhauer emphasized the importance of the, quote, blind, impulsive will to guide us through, end quote, to guide us through the turbulent storms of life. He emphasized that existence itself is tied up with a violent struggle, and it is the blind, impulsive will which can guide us through that violent struggle. It's weird spiritual stuff. But it's weird spiritual stuff trying to establish a new sense of how to struggle through the cosmic turmoil of life in a way that is detached from, the Christian answer to that question. Hitler's ideal form of state was one in which a visionary with a tremendous will himself could guide the nation through the struggles of existence, like the struggles of existence for the nation, to survive and thrive. I have the source there for that idea. His social Darwinism led him to interpret the struggle which the Germanic people faced as a racial struggle first and foremost, especially against the Jews, but also against the Slavs, who Hitler perceived as major opponents to German hegemony in Central Europe. He was also inspired by Richard Wagner, a German composer who lived from 1813 to 1883. Wagner composed a number of operas which revolutionized modern orchestral music. He composed powerful emotive operas, which shattered the expectations of traditional compositions. He was also a polemicist, and he was extremely critical of Jewish-controlled financial institutions. He criticized the Jewish influence on music. He believes that music emerged out of the soul of someone who was fully invested in the Volk. Here we see that primacy of the Volk in Germanic Enlightenment thought once again. And since the Jews were only partial members of the German civilization, he believed that their music lacked any soul. Hitler was enamored with Wagner's music, and he believed it embodied the German spirit better than any other composer's music, and he had it played at a great number of Nazi events. Houston Stewart Chamberlain was Germanic but grew up in Britain. He lived from 1855 to 1927. Chamberlain's Foundations of the 19th Century used social Darwinistic tenets to argue that the Aryan race was the superior race and that the Teutonic people had had a positive influence on European civilization, while the Jewish race had had a perpetually negative influence on the West. He argued that all European people, including the Germans, Celts, Slavs, Greeks, and Latins, were members of the Aryan race, the prehistoric ethnic group which spoke the original Indo-European language, and that is accurate. And linguists do believe that all of those nationalities, ethnicities, do derive from one common ethnic group because of the common root words in all of their languages. Here's a quote by Chamberlain. Certain anthropologists would fain teach us that all races are equally gifted. We point to history and answer that is a lie. The races of mankind are markedly different in the nature and also in the extent of their gifts, and the Germanic races belong to the most highly gifted group, the group usually termed Aryan. Physically and mentally, the Aryans are preeminent among all people. For that reason, they are by right the lords of the world. Do we not see the Homo Syriacus develop just as well and as happily in the position of slave as of a master? So he's referring to a different race as being a different species, basically using that term there. And then he also said, do the Chinese not show us another example of the same nature? He's arguing that Chinese are just as content being slaves as they are being masters, arguing that they have not been bred by the forces of nature that Darwin argued about. The Chinese and the Homo Syriacus have not been bred to be masters of the world, but he argues that the Aryan race has. He did say that the Teutonic have had a perpetually positive influence on Western civilization, so I want to look at some of those contributions of the Germanic people on Western civilization, just to poke a little bit of fun into the idea that the Germans have always had a good influence on the West. The Germans were responsible for sacking Rome and driving the West into several centuries of chaos and poverty. The Germans are responsible for perpetuating the heresy of Arianism throughout the West because they adopted Arianism institutionally. It did not fade from Germanic nations until the 9th century. They are responsible for investiture controversies, trying to claim the authority to name bishops from the Pope. They are responsible for Protestantism. Thanks a lot for that. And they are also responsible for communism. Karl Marx was German. World War I was instigated mostly by the Germans, and the biggest atrocities of World War I, gas attacks, bombs upon civilians, and the use of, what was the other one? Bombing, hospital ships. The Germans were the ones who did all of those actions first. Hitler himself, of course, is German, and then today, the blasphemous synodal way is another gift of the German people upon the world. I myself am Austrian, so I'm I guess a hair better than traditional Prussian civilization, but we can see the Germans have not had a great influence on Western civilization. It's almost as though they've been the perpetual bad guy, but maybe that can change, Okay, another influential philosopher, Arthur de Guébenau, French, living from 1816 to 1882. He's considered one of the founding fathers of scientific race theory. His essay on the inequality of the human races of 1855 argued that there were significant intellectual disparities between races, and that the fall of civilizations exists when intermarriage between races becomes prevalent, and that the white race was, in fact, the superior race. He believes that Adam is the originator of the white species, and that the white descendants of Adam divided into the Hamites, the Semites, and the Japhetites, occurring much later on. I don't know what I meant by that, but he believes that basically Adam is only the ancestor of the whites. Amongst the whites, he identified the Aryan race as the pinnacle of human development. In the 19th century, so basically what he's implying here is that like blacks or Asians, Indians, he's implying that they're not made in the image of God. Basically, they're not descendants of Adam and Eve, which is radically not what Christian revelation has ever said. In the 19th century, scientific race theory, developed from his original thoughts, was widely accepted in the scientific community. Today, it is considered complete pseudoscience. It is off limits to investigate any sort of racial differences besides external appearance. And to be sure, scientific racism is bad, and it's obviously it can lead to a lot of evil stuff, as we saw. But I mean, in Christian anthropology, there's a recognition that all people are children of Adam and Eve, making us all familial in our origins, and there's a recognition that all people share equal dignity as children of God. So with that, kind of the issues of scientific racism would have been solved. It's completely off limits to even look at how different like parts of the world or different ethnic lines kind of diverged with different traits. Obviously, you can see different skin colors or whatnot, but now science has to completely stay away at investigating any other potential genetic differences out of fear of scientific racism. If Christian anthropology still stood at the heart of even science, even natural sciences, there wouldn't have to be so much fear of investigating genetic differences between races, because there would have been this overwhelming understanding that all the races have equal dignity as being made in the image and likeness of God. Okay? Alfred Rosenberg was a German who lived from 1893 to 1946, and he was actually promoted to a government official position from 1939 to 1945. He was executed in 1946 by the Allies. In 1930, he's famous for publishing The Myth of the 20th Century as a sort of Nazi mythos. He was, in a sense, attempting to found a new religion. Historian Peter Verek says that Rosenberg bores both the uneducated and as well as the well-educated, but it is the God of the semi-educated whom earnest dullness and obscure grandiloquence impress as scholarly and authoritative. In one portion of the text, Key claims that the Aryan race was originated in the mythical island of Atlantis. So he's creating something that looks historical, but in reality, he's trying to create a myth because he believes the same idea that Mussolini believed in Italy, that to truly unite the nation, there needs to be a common myth that everyone kind of holds on to. And so because he recognized that, he's trying to create a mythical origin of the Aryan people, which can kind of take the place of the Christian traditional origin of all people as one human family. The text is then untethered from reality, and it played upon the subjective desire to perceive the Germanic nation as being larger than life and, in a sense, godlike. Hitler promoted the myth of the 20th century, and the Nazi Party encouraged it to be read. So there is this desire here to establish a mythos of the German people, which is free or liberal in relation to traditional Christian historiography. Paul Anton de Lagarde was a German who lived from 1827 to 1891. He was a biblical scholar who despised Christianity. He attempted to establish a German nationalist religion which championed imperialist values and fought a cosmic struggle against the Jews and the Slavs. He said, "Germany is the totality of all German feeling, German thinking, German willing Germans. In this sense, every one of us is a traitor if he does not consider himself personally accountable in every moment of his life for the existence, fortune, and future of the fatherland. And each is a hero and liberator if he does." That is idolatrous if I've ever seen it, describing every person must every moment of their life be working towards the existence, fortune, and future of Germany. That's very idolatrous, placing Germany in the center of the heart and the soul rather than God. He also said one would have to have a heart of steel to not feel sympathy for the poor Germans, and by the same token, to not hate the Jews, to not hate and despise those who, out of humanity, advocate for the Jews or are too cowardly to crush these vermin. You're seeing here Lagarde who once again died in 1891, so he's right in the middle of that French Enlightenment and the period after it. He's identifying the Jews as sort of the cosmic rivals of the Germanic people. In this mythos in which the glory of the German nation takes the place of the glory of God at the center of the German imagination, the Jewish people, that ethnicity, takes the place of the forces of the demonic in the new German mythos. Georges Sorel, a French philosopher who lived from 1847 to 1922, is the founder of the economic movement of Sorelianism, which considered itself to be a revision of Marxism rather than an opponent of it. Originally, Sorel advocated for a general strike rather than a class war to bring about the rise of the proletariat. He believed that a strong national mythos was necessary to unite the nation into a new economic and political order. By 1910, Sorel had adjusted his views in supporting integral nationalism. In France at the time, integral nationalism was actually focused on reestablishing the ancient regime of Christendom in France. Integral nationalism had the potential to provide a counter-economic system to capitalism because it advocated for a new system in which the production of a national economy was ordered towards the nation's prosperity, and so the state would have control over all the means of production in the name of the nation itself, rather than simply private individuals being in control of the means of production to pursue their own personal prosperity. Sorel ended up dying as a Marxist. He ended up supporting the USSR after the Russian Revolution. His support of a national mythos and an integral nationalist economic system influenced the mythos and the economic theories of both fascism and the Nazi Party. And once again, he considered his thought to be an alternative to Marxism rather than a diametrically opposed opponent of it. And remember that Nazism, the word Nazi, was an abbreviation for the Nationalist Socialist Party, because Nazism is an alternative to communism, but not entirely opposed to it. Paul Anton de Lagarde was a German who lived from 1860 to 1940. He was a biologist and eugenist who coined the term racial hygiene as a euphemism for forced sterilization. He advocated for a racial hygiene movement in Germany. He published a book titled Racial Hygiene Basics in 1895. In 1904, he published the world's first eugenicist periodical. In 1905, he formed the German Society for Racial Hygiene, and in 1907, this became the International Society for Racial Hygiene. In 1930, he was made, so this is during Hitler's regime, he was made an honorary doctor of the University of Munich, and he became an avid supporter of the Nazi Party, as he saw this party as fervently carrying out his ideas about racial hygiene. After his death, a Nazi government official who had a background in secular atheistic psychology named Ernst Rudin, so Ernst Rudin, who we talked about earlier, he published an article in Sanger's Birth Control Review. He said that his meritorious services have helped set up our Nazi ideology. Okay, I intended on now discussing why fascism was liberal, and I will do that in a separate video. We'll talk all about fascism in a whole separate video because I do want to keep this video not at the 2-hour length. I know it's going to be longer, but I do want to kind of cover all the Hitler stuff in one video. So let's talk now about the personal spiritual beliefs of Adolf Hitler, what he thought about Christianity in general, and then we'll kind of wrap this up here, okay? Let's do an overview of Hitler's religious views. Hitler was born to a mother named Clara Hitler, whose own Jewish physician described her as faithful, humble, and a kind woman. So his mother was a faithful Catholic. His father, on the other hand, Alois Hitler, was skeptical of the Catholic Church and had been described as a free, which is synonymous with liberal, thinker. See the source there. Hitler himself was baptized and confirmed upon his mother's insistence. One account says that he looked very angry during his confirmation, as though he were forced to be there. And those who knew him reported that he never attended church again after the age of 18. As a politician, Hitler endorsed German Christianity, a Protestant sect that supported Nazi values. He later endorsed what was called non-denominational positive Christianity, which promoted liberal heresies such as the denial of the divinity of Jesus, and also positive non-denominational Christianity removed Jewish elements from the Bible. And you could see a picture there on the right of a disgusting church, which is, having a Nazi flag right in the sanctuary, not unlike, disgusting Methodist churches today that have rainbow flags right in their sanctuaries. Hitler lauded Martin Luther for possessing, quote, the merit of rising against the Pope and the Catholic Church, end quote. Once he took power, Hitler took steps towards eliminating political Catholicism because he perceived political Catholicism, authentic conservatism, which was the authentic conservative movement in German politics at the time. He perceived this as opposed to his own belief that the church should have no influence over the state, which is, of course, the quintessential liberal political belief, going back to Voltaire. See the source there. We're going to look at not just what I have to say, but this is what a number of historians have said about Hitler's religious views. I'm quoting them just to show that it is the common historiographical interpretation of Hitler's religious views that he did hold liberal religious views. So this comes from Alan Bullock. In Hitler's eyes, Christianity was a religion fit only for slaves. He detested its ethics in particular. Its teaching, he declared, was a rebellion against the natural law of selection by struggle and the survival of the fittest. In other words, he preferred liberal Darwinism to Christian anthropology. This comes from Ian Kershaw, the preeminent historical expert on Adolf Hitler. He said, in early 1937, he was declaring that Christianity was ripe for destruction, and that the churches must therefore yield to the primacy of the state, railing against the most horrible institution imaginable. The primacy of the state is a Voltairean liberal political view. Hitler believed, this comes from, Richard Evans. Hitler believed that science would easily destroy the last remaining vestiges of superstition. If that doesn't sound like an Enlightenment liberal thought, I don't know what does. Richard Overy said, both Stalin and Hitler wanted a neutered religion, subservient to the state, while the slow program of scientific revelation destroyed the foundation of religious myth. End quote. Overy also argued that Hitler held identical religious views to Joseph Stalin, but was more reserved in expressing those liberal religious views because he wanted to be perceived as opposed to the godlessness of the communists. He, in a sense, trumped up his anti-communism because he knew this would be popular with constituents in Germany, because communism was very unpopular. In reality, Nazism is a different take on the liberal economic theories of Marx, rather than absolutely opposed to it. Both communism and Nazism believe that the state should have ultimate control of the means of production, but there's just nuanced different ideological opinions about what the state should then do once it is in control of all the means of economic production. Overy also wrote that though Hitler has often been portrayed as a neo-pagan, or the centerpiece of a political religion in which he played the godhead, his views had much more in common with the revolutionary iconoclasm of the Bolshevik enemy, end quote. Hitler's atheism was also inspired by George Hegel. So Hitler's atheism led him to supplant his, natural human desire for spirituality with a belief in Hegel's liberal doctrines, which he wrote about in The Will of the World Spirit. Hegel's belief in the will of the world spirit. That's not the name of a text. That's a core doctrine of Hegel's liberal thought. Hitler perceived himself as embodying the archetypal hero of Hegel's concept of the world historical individuals who shaped human history by guiding it according to their impulsive wills. That's what Hegel believed was guiding human history, was the impulsive wills of world historical individuals. Hitler perceived himself as one of those such heroes, and he believed that he would accomplish the will of the world spirit by following his own impulsive will. This led him to develop a belief in his own infallibility and inerrancy as the absolute Führer of the German Third Reich, and that is also why he made such ridiculous decisions, especially in his attempted conquest of the USSR. Okay, we were going to talk about anti-Semitic theories next, And it's a very important topic. It's a little off topic because it's not necessarily liberal or conservative to believe in the global Jewish conspiracy. I will say this about it here, but I am going to post this as a separate video in the next week or so. Hitler did believe in a global Jewish conspiracy, and believing in that the Jews were all united in this global effort to kind of take over the world's institutions. That's not necessarily liberal, but the way in which Hitler inserted that belief into his kind of liberal German Enlightenment-based mythos, that the Germans were in this cosmic struggle, the German Volk needed to be protected, that he was embodying the world influential individual, he was a great hero, guiding the German nation into the future. That mythos, that was born of the liberal German Enlightenment, required a cosmic enemy. And so he combined his belief, which was somewhat popular, in a global Jewish conspiracy with the need for a cosmic enemy, and he inserted the Jewish ethnicity into that worldview. And he's also going to combine the belief that the Jews are the great cosmic opponent of the Germans, which is fictional. Okay, he believed in that, and we're going to talk about that conspiracy, which I know a lot of my viewers have been commenting about over the past few weeks. So I will give it a whole video and address it again. I'm going to talk about some of your guys' thoughts about these Jewish conspiracies. I'm going to take what I've kind of seen in the comments and address them. So Hitler believed the Jews were having this conspiracy. He put that conspiracy as in his mythos as the great enemy of the German nation, and then combined with his eugenicist beliefs and his social Darwinism, believed the Jews were the inferior race, so they had no right to survive, and using the tactics of eugenicists, he intended on eliminating the entire German population. The entire Jewish population. So a lot of liberal ideas of Hitler combined with his belief in the global Jewish conspiracy to have absolutely disastrous effects. So we will talk about all of that. We're even going to talk about St. Edith Stein a little bit in a separate video, who was ethnically Jewish but was a Catholic convert and a nun, and she would give her life in the Holocaust. One last thing here. Hitler and the gays. So, following the lead of psychological opinion at the time, Hitler's regime classified homosexuality as a mental illness and penalized it as a crime. Men caught in homosexual acts were imprisoned, and it's estimated that up to 12,000 may have died as laborers in concentration camps. Homosexual political organizations were banned, but it's also worth noting that nearly all political organizations were banned, which were outside of the one legitimate party in Nazi Germany. It should be noted that during the 1920s and 30s, only the most radical segments of the liberal intelligentsia had arrived at sexual conclusions anywhere near the current liberal dogmas regarding LGBT matters and the concept of transgenderism that was not even really floating around in liberal intelligentsia in the 1930s. So Hitler's homosexual policies do not indicate that he was not a liberal. They do indicate he was not amongst the most radical liberals of the time period in the matters of sexuality. But he was simply following the lead of mainstream secular psychological opinion in the way he dealt with homosexuals. So him persecuting homosexuals, he's following the lead of mainstream psychologists during the time period, and he's combining what secular psychologists were saying with his belief in eugenics and helping him come to the conclusion that they should just basically be gotten rid of, even though they wouldn't have reproduced anyways. But that's beside the point. Okay? So in this video, we have discussed the genealogy of the Nazi fascist movement and the liberal philosophers that Nazism was inspired by. We are going to look at fascism next time. We did look at Hitler's personal liberalism, and we are going to address the Jewish conspiracy that Hitler believed in. We're going to address that in a later video. Okay, let's end with a prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spirituis Sancti. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spirituis Sancti. May Almighty God remove from your minds anything I've said that is unpleasing to him or untrue. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you, and see you next time. Bye.